I got a new deck today, and it's this one here. It's called Alchemy, and it's by Kim Kranz. And I drew a card for us, and it is this one here, which is called Sugar. And it's actually all about looking out for joy and pleasure where you find it. And so I thought that was a really lovely one to get us off. It's a good beginning.
Hi, welcome to Fiberchats. My name is Irina. I'm the host here. My guest today comes from Edinburgh, Scotland, Emmy Palko. And Emmy is my fellow YouTuber. So you have your own podcast.
Yeah.
And you also a goddess guide.
I am, yes.
So, you know, that sugar card, tell me more.
Well, do you know, I think of joy seeking as being a practice. You know, so this looking out for the sugar, you know, I think really reminds us actually that pleasure is available to us all, and it's part of our natural birthright, and it really calls us into our bodies, you know, because pleasure is something that's experienced as a tangible, tactile thing, a really kind of sensual experience of being embodied. And I think, if anything, the goddesses invite us to have an embodied experience of our lives. You know, they want us to come back and really access the wisdom that's present in the here and the now and in the flesh. So that's what I would connect up to the sugar card.
I'm so glad that Fiberchats got sugar card. I mean, it sounds like such a wonderful card. Well, let's talk about your fiber journey, because I know your mom is an avid knitter and has been all her life, and she cannot remember how she learned how to knit. Do you remember how you learned how to knit?
No, but I do know that my grandma taught me. So my mum's mum taught me. Sometimes in the summer holidays, we would go and spend like a couple of weeks with my grandparents. And I'm pretty sure it was probably over one of those summer holidays when we were running a ragged, and she probably just wanted us to sit down and be calm for a little while. But I can't actually remember not knowing what to do with needles in my hands. So it's just always been a present part of my life, just as it has for my mum, and I suspect as it has for my grandma also.
Well, I mean, so to me, when I listen to your podcast, besides the fact that it has very calming effect on me somehow, like just your voice, and it's like, it's so relaxing, and I love like knitting and listening to you at the same time. But I noticed this thing where you always talk about how to tweak some patterns and how like certain designers have certain tendencies and you have to watch out for them if it doesn't work for your body type. Like, do you remember the earliest experience of adjusting things to fit you?
Oh, that's really interesting. I think I've always really loved clothes, and I've always really loved, you know, expressing myself through what I was wearing. And as a teenager, I think I was a pretty wacky dresser. And so I think particularly because of that, I was always going to thrift shops. I was always going to charity shops and vintage clothes shops. And so the kind of clothes that you would buy off the high street were never really all that appealing. But with thrift shop clothes, quite often you're looking at different sizes, you're looking at things like positive and negative ease. You know, the size on the label no longer really makes any sense, because, you know, a size, well, in the UK, I say a size 12 20 years ago is not a UK size 12 now. So the labeling on clothes actually became really pretty irrelevant. And so I think, you know, being able to take those and adapt them and wear them in ways that I felt fitted me or suited me or said what I wanted to say, I think that's always just been a part of my personal self-expression.
Well, so you mentioned that you like never not knitting, which is like one of my favorite hashtags on Instagram, because it's like just so describing my lifestyle.
Yeah.
How do you choose what you're gonna knit next? Like, how do you pick those patterns?
Oh, that's such a good question. I mean, for me, it's actually quite almost like an intangible thing, like an ephemeral like draw. You know, you just get that almost that quickening in your pulse, and you go, oh, you know, there's that excitement and that inspiration, and then all of a sudden you start to think about, your stash and the different colors or different options that you have, and then it all starts to come together. And I love it when a project like that kind of starts to fall into place. And then it just very naturally finds its place in the queue of things, although there are plenty in the queue.
Well, I mean, is there like ever a moment in your life when you don't feel like knitting or don't have that inspiration and like scroll through Instagram or Ravelry and nothing jumps at you?
Very occasionally. It's like sometimes it happens when you're like in between projects. So like you've completed one project, but you've not quite started the next, and everything that you kind of lined up isn't quite as sparkly as it was when you first pulled the project together. No, absolutely. And I think at those times, it generally just lasts a day or so for me, because it cycles through pretty quickly, thank goodness. But yes, for me, one of the things that works systematically is casting on a Stephen West project.
I can't go wrong with Stephen.
You can. I think it's like joy on your needles. There's so much inspiration and exploration to happen within your creativity, within one of his projects, within one of his designs, that I think it can't fail to reignite the knitter's mojo.
Well, I mean, are there like other designers that you keep coming back to?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I tend to knit a lot of Andrea Mowry sweaters in particular, because I know her shapes really suit my body, and her patterns, there's particular sizing within her patterns that suits me very well. So I know, so that's quite a reliable designer for me to come back to. So she's certainly one. I love Hoki Locatelli patterns. I think her intelligence in the way that she constructs designs and patterns just blows me away, and never fails to delight me when I'm putting something together of her designs, and then all of a sudden you get that moment where it all begins to come together, and it's like, oh. It's like when you find like that last piece of the jigsaw puzzle and pop it in, it's the same kind of feeling for me with a Hoki pattern. So yeah, so I mean those are obviously larger designers, but there's lots of other designers. I love Yamagara. I love her knits, particularly I think for summertime knits. I think she does really beautiful things. And Junko Okamoto, I love her. So every time I do one of her patterns, I think, gosh, this is a statement piece. This is an investment, and it always pays off. So
well,
yeah,
you mentioned that queue. Like, what's your Ravelry library looks like? I mean, is that like a whole different hobby from knitting?
I'm generally pretty good at knitting the patterns that I have, and I generally knit my patterns more than once. I do get a real amount. I noticed my mum does exactly the same thing. We knit the same pattern more than once, and sometimes several times over, because there's partially, it's like when you reread a favorite book or something, you get to go and live in that world for a little bit of time. And it's not so much because you want to find out what happens next, it's just because you want the experience of being in that story verse. And I think the same kind of thing with a pattern that you've already knitted once before. You get to live through that experience of creating that garment or that shawl again. And there's a comfort to that, but there's also a real sensual pleasure within it too. So
well, I mean, like when you approach the same pattern for the second or third time, how much does it look the same, or how much you change within that pattern suddenly?
I generally do quite a lot of changes, but sometimes it'll just be because I'm using different colors, or because I almost always substitute different yarns. I very rarely knit, but I don't think I ever knit the specified yarn for a pattern. And so that means that it's constantly, going to evolve and change depending on which version I'm knitting. I really like to play with texture and with fiber. I like to add a bit of fluff, or to create a bit of drape, or to explore color variants as well. So mixing up tonals with variegated. And so I think the options within one particular design are so incredibly vast. which you see, you know, through Ravelry projects. You know, if you click on the projects and you see that everybody's done their own version, you can see just how incredibly wide the options are for people within these particular projects and designs. They're just templates after all, you know, it's about our creativity and what we're pouring into it. And that for me is where the real juice is. So I can knit the same pattern over and over and over, and every single one will look really quite different.
Well, I saw that new wall of shawls that you just put together.
Yeah.
And there's quite a few there, like it's a whole collection of shawls. Do you wear everything you need? Do you, like, what happens to stuff that you need?
Yeah, I would say I wear knitted objects most days. I don't think many days go past, even if it's just actually to throw a shawl in a bag for later on, just in case. And in Edinburgh, that just in case quite often comes to me. But yes, I do. I wear almost all my knits, I think. If I'm not wearing a knit, then I like to really sort of sit with that and ask, you know, what is going on there? You know, why am I not wearing it? What's not working? And I'm absolutely not averse to ripping that back down, even if it's, you know, a year's old knit, or maybe it's just a really recent one, to reclaim the yarn and use it for something else, because it's a resource, you know, and it's precious. You know, it's been produced, it's been grown, it's been spun, it's been dyed. You know, I really want to make use of that and be able to put it into rotation in my own personal wardrobe.
What would make you take something apart? Like what kind of mistake, or what kind, like how bad does it have to be?
Well, I have two things which are currently waiting to be ripped back. So one of them is the Sunday cardigan mohair edition by Petite Knit, and the size that I've knitted is far too big. It doesn't sit right on my shoulders. I have quite slopey shoulders, so things are quite often falling off my shoulders, and I don't mind that, but when it's a cardigan, it's it becomes a bit unmanageable. So and then the other thing that I'm going to be ripping back is the Chunky Magnolia cardigan. Is it by Camilla Vad? And I've knitted it at completely the wrong gauge. So again, I should have done a gauge swatch, and I didn't.
Do you usually do the swatches? Like, what's your relationship? Because, like, I notice with knitters, it's a love-hate. There are people who actually love swatching. Like my friend David van de Kamp, I mean, he's obsessed with swatching. He'll swatch stuff on like 7 different yarns and using 7 different needles before he decides on what fabric looks best for his next project. I'm on the other like side of the spectrum, where if there is any way for me to avoid swatching, like I'll find that way. Where are you?
I am probably, I was going to say somewhere in the middle, but I'm probably closer to you than David in that regard. I will generally swatch, particularly when I'm doing yarn substitution, which is most of the time. And if it's a larger and more time involved project, because there's nothing worse than pouring like a month's worth of your knitting time and energy, and you know your joints and you know your physical being gets poured into this particular project, and then getting at the end of it and finding that it doesn't fit and it doesn't do what you needed it to do, or you know you don't like the fabric or something. So yes, I will do a swatch if it's going to be a long, bigger project. But if it's just going to be something I can quickly whip out in the next, like in 3 to 4 days or something, then sometimes I'm not. I certainly don't swatch for a shawl. I never swatch for a shawl. I would only swatch for a fit, really, I think.
Well, I mean, like out of all the items you need per year, what percentage would you say are garments versus accessories?
I think this year, and I think it probably varies, I would say this year is probably more garment heavy because I've been knitting for my children. So I've been knitting jumpers for the kids. And so that's taken up a lot more of my knitting time. And then I've been sort of focused as well on a couple of different pieces for myself. But that has kind of switched, I think, in the summertime, because now everything is about the shawls. So,
well, I mean, your kids are in their like late teens and 20s, which are like, so are mine. Are you concerned with them taking proper care of the garments that you knit for them? Because I just gave one of the tops that I knitted, which was actually designed by David Van de Kamp. I gave, it's called Miss Regency tops. So my daughter came over and I was like, do you want to try it on? And she loved it. And I was like, well, let me tell you how to wash it. And she just rolled her eyes at me. Are you concerned with your kids?
I would say I have trained them pretty well. They know what happens when you wash something in the like I hand it in the washing machine and it felts, because I have done that and they've seen the carnage afterwards. My daughter is a knitter as well, so she's I don't ever have to worry about, she's going to, felt something or wash it wrong. And the boys are pretty good with it too, although I'm not really sure how often they're washing their jumpers, if I'm completely honest. And generally the jumpers that I am knitting for them are like larger pieces to be worn over the tops of things anyway, so they probably don't need a huge amount of washing. But if they did, they might find their way back into my wash bag, and I'll sort out for them.
I mean, the beauty of wool, that it's basically self-cleaning and it doesn't need to be like constantly washed,
Exactly. Unless they slither something down the front, it's probably fine.
Well, tell me, like, how much, like when you pick a project, like, do you usually try to knit for others or for yourself? Like, how selfish are you in your knits?
I think I move through phases. I get a huge amount of joy knitting something for another person. I feel like I get to hold them close while I'm in the knitting process of the garment or the shawl. And then the experience of giving that to them and seeing their delight and watching them wear it and enjoy it. That is hugely fulfilling. So, in some regards, there is like a kind of a selfish aspect to gift knitting as well, because, the giver receives something from the gift also. And I do love knitting things for myself. I do, tend to buy yarn based on what my own personal preferences are. I very rarely buy yarn because I think, oh, that would be really lovely as a jumper for somebody else. Which means that when I do come to knit something for somebody, I do have to buy something specific, because I would say my stash is basically my, deconstructed wardrobe.
Well, I mean, like, let's talk about your stash. So because you've been knitting all your life, how big is it now? And like, how did it change over the years?
I have had a stash. I mean, I remember having a stash as a teenager. So I'm out for a long time. I would say a lot of my yarn to begin with was, so I lived quite close to the Peyton's wool mill in the Hillfoots, just outside of Stirling in the central belt of Scotland. And so my grandma and I used to go to this woolen mill and we would get our wool from there. So a lot of it was that. But then I really loved a lot of Rowan yarns as well. And I used to save up for yarn from Rowan. Particularly, I used to get all of the Rowan magazines as well. So, the spring, summer one and the autumn, winter ones. And so, yes, I would save up. I would say that when I was in my 20s, which is, I had my first child when I was 19 and I had my third when I was 22. So I had my kids really close together. And there wasn't like a huge amount of extra money to buy, yarn. So the stash was pretty small at that point. I would say that it's accumulated over the years.
Well, now when you go to buy new yarn, like what attracts you? Are you going with like specific project in mind? Are you disciplined about it, or are you going for certain texture, color? or you like hope that the yarn is going to inspire you to make something?
Yeah, I generally buy with a particular project in mind. So if I find a yarn, quite often I'm a bargain hunter. I love a bargain. So if there's a sale on, I'm all over it. But I won't allow myself generally to buy it unless I've got an idea of what I would put it to. Like generally, what would I use it for? And so if I can come up with something in my head to justify buying it, then I will buy it.
I mean, how often it ends up being what you bought it for?
Oh, maybe about 50-50, I would say. I do have like particular yarn in the stash that is there specifically for projects. So they're in like plastic bags and all sealed up and everything. And that's the yarn for a particular project. So for example, I've got yarn for a plum by Junko Okamoto. And I've had that sitting there probably for about the last 2 years or so. So it's not jumped on the needles yet, but it's all set, you know, it's waiting. It's in the wings. And I have a few projects like that. But generally, you know, I'll justify the purchase of the yarn, and then it goes into the stash, and then it's available to, if that needs to get repurposed, which it quite often does.
Well, you mentioned that your daughter is a knitter. Is there ever like any yarn missing that you were planned to do something with and it becomes something else for her wardrobe?
No, generally, she's got quite different colouring from me in general. So her yarn colour choices tend to be quite different from my own anyway. So, but she has some beautiful skeins in her stash as well. We would go to Edinburgh Yarn Festival together, and so she would get some lovely hand-dyed skeins and things, and I've given her some yarn as well in the past. So she's got a nice wee stash building there too.
Well, let's talk about your YouTube journey. Like, what made you that day when you like sat on your bed and put that camera in front of you and pulled that first card for the viewers? What made you decide to do that?
Well, it's been something I've been thinking about for a long time. And the first episode was August 2020, you know, so it's really the year changed for all of us. And we just come through a very long lockdown in Scotland, as I think the rest of the world had as well. And we were coming through a pretty restricted summer, you know, so we weren't able to see each other in the way and hang out with each other in the way that we were before. I'd been attending a very lively knit night every Monday, and that had moved online, but we weren't meeting up in person, and I was really missing that as well. On top of that, my mum lives in France, so my mum was always she was always saying, you know, you should do a podcast. I think she just wanted me to sit and talk about my knitting so that she could see what I was working on. And then my friend Jackie from Caddy Jack's Knits as well, she was saying, I think you should really do a podcast. I think it would be really good fun, and I think you would do it really well. So it was really kind of with their encouragement and this real feeling that I wanted to share my knitting time with others that really kind of brought me to the camera for the first time. But I do remember the morning of recording it, that first episode, I kind of had to trick myself into doing it, you know, so I would find myself just kind of like bringing together like a few bits and pieces and then putting them down on the bed, and then I would go away for a while, and then I'd come back and I'd pop another couple of things, and gradually the episode began to form, spread out across the duvet.
I mean, how planned are you in your episodes? Like, how far ahead do you start planning it, outlining it, and how like meticulously you're sticking to the timeline?
So I generally start planning on paper the morning of recording. So I'll sit down with my notepad and my cup of tea, and I'll draw a card and for the day, and I will write up like, what am I wearing? What's the finished objects? What's the works in progress? What am I thinking of casting on? What's new to me? and what's bringing me joy, and then finishing it off with some kind of reading. So that's generally going to be the structure, and it doesn't really vary all that much. So it's really just a case of sitting down and working through all of that and making sure that I've refreshed my memory on what designs or what yarns I've used, and what it is that I want to say about each piece. And then I'll just sit down and record. But basically it's a running jump. Do you know what I mean?
I mean, you're saying like, and then I just sit down and record. Is it easy for you? Because when I'm interviewing people, it's actually became much easier for me, right? Like at the beginning, I was freaking out. Now I'm sort of like, I got it.
Yeah.
When I'm recording myself, even for 30 seconds, it takes probably an hour, because I'm just like I'm tongue-tied. I forget everything I wanted to say. It's just like a nightmare.
Yeah.
How is do you just sit and talk and it comes so naturally to you?
Apparently talking is one of my superpowers. Well, I think, my tip for that would be is that, like I said, my mum and my friend Jackie were very supportive of beginning the podcast. So when I started, I had no idea that anybody else was going to watch it, so when I recorded it, I just felt like I was, like recording a video message for my friends, and my family, and those were the ones that were going to watch it. So I just spoke to them like I would speak to them all the time, and I think it's that kind of conversational flow that you can really kind of cultivate by just sort of holding on to that perspective, rather than thinking I'm talking to myself and myself is being reflected back in the video screen, and I keep forgetting to look at the camera, and oh my God, I've said again, or you can kind of get out of your head a bit, because when you're talking to a friend, you generally are not monitoring your speech patterns, or you're not second guessing your gestures or your mannerisms or the repetitions or anything like that. You're just communicating. You're just getting your message across. So generally I generally don't have a problem with talking.
Well, I mean, now that you think back on that first episode, right, it has 29,000 views. So this is a lot of friends who sat there and watch you say, "Hi, Mom," and tell her about your needs, right? By the way, hi, friends. Thank you for all that watching. Who do you talk to now? Like when you record it and you know how many people actually watch your podcast, who is in your mind you're talking to?
Yeah, I think it's the same. I think it's just that kind of broader sense of community. It's assuming good intent, that people are on your side, and people are watching it because they want to be there, and because they enjoy you, and because they want to find out what you're working on, and they want to feel inspired, and you want to share that with them. So, really kind of encouraging that sense of community connection and belonging and conversation.
Well, let me ask you something like logistically, right? So you have an episode coming. You have like a couple of weeks between them. So in 2 weeks, you have to need enough material to fill 40 minutes of the podcast. Are you ever under pressure that like, oh my God, what I'm going to talk about, I only needed 7 rows on that sock? Like, I mean, do you ever stress over things you're going to show?
I think I probably did earlier on. I don't so much now. And I think that's actually because I came to peace with my scheduling. So I now don't podcast every 2 weeks. I generally podcast every 3 weeks. 3 weeks is plenty knitting to talk about, and all the other things besides, new patterns that have come out, or new yarn that has mysteriously come into your life. Or television programs that you've been watching, or just general, there's a lot of life that happens in a 3-week period. So I generally don't find that I'm reaching or I'm stretching. Sometimes I'll structure what I'm knitting on a little bit more, because I'm aware that it's going to be talked about in the podcast. So sometimes I'll think I would like to get that finished, but I'll put that to one side and I'll work on this other piece a little bit more, and that way I'll have the 2 pieces to talk about. But I would work on them anyway. So
I mean, do you like pick patterns based on what you think people would want to see? Because like certain, like, okay, if you need Stephen West shawl, right?
Mhm.
You know the audience is wide just because he has such a huge following and he has so many people who like enthusiastic fans, right? So it's gonna bring more views, it's gonna bring more reactions, more comments. Whereas if you need a pattern by some totally unknown designer, people might look at it and think, oh, pretty, but like the reaction is not going to be the same, right? The searchability is not the same also.
Yeah.
Like, does that ever influences what you need?
Never ever. I think if I went down that route, I think it would absolutely stultify my creative process. I think one of the things that's super important to me is my own personal creative sovereignty. And so I have to be the one who's in charge of my knitting, and I can't make those decisions based on metrics. I can't make those kinds of decisions based on what other people are wanting to see or who are interested to see. I can only knit that which brings me joy. And if I don't do that, then nobody else is going to be interested in seeing what I'm knitting anyway.
I mean, are you like ever thinking about like all the algorithm games and like how you should phrase something and how you should name something? Because, it's like I'm watching sometimes the videos and they're like, put something shocking in the title. And I'm like, I'm talking to knitters. How shocking is that, And if I'm gonna
be shocked.
and if I'm gonna start every title is gonna be shocking, people just gonna be like, oh, that's ridiculous, I'm gonna leave, right? So it's like, do you ever think about YouTube games?
No, never ever. In fact, I very rarely look at my statistics on YouTube. I don't find them terribly interesting. I think what I find interesting is connecting with people. And actually, word of mouth, I think, generally will boost channels much more so than this kind of game playing. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there are people who play games and end up with 100,000 subscribers. I don't know. But for me, the subscriber count isn't actually what's all that important. What's important for me is the individual subscriber. Like, why have they chosen to subscribe? What are they getting out of the podcast? What's our connection here? And can we make that a meaningful connection by sharing, important things? So it's not just, the design or the yarn, but it's also the stories that sit behind the knitting and why we do what we do. And I think when you open up from that perspective, people are much more likely to respond to you. They're much more likely to comment. You're much more likely to create a genuine bond with people because that integrity shines through. And then from there, they're far more likely to subscribe, they're more likely to share, they're more likely to tell their friends about your work, or get them to, or sit down and watch with their mum, as some people do, or because they're enjoying it and they feel that genuine connection and that genuine friendship, because it's a truthful connection.
Right. Well, when you have the same people commenting on all your videos, like, do you have your fans that were there from like the first episode and they're like always there every time you post?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you can see, the same names coming up, and, you become familiar with people. And then, of course, you start connecting with people over on Instagram as well. And sometimes people will send you messages of things that they think you might be interested in, or, so absolutely these, the first point of connection might be through the YouTube channel, but it starts to filter through it in lots of different ways too. So yeah.
Do you ever feel like a celebrity? Like, here you were sitting home knitting by yourself, and suddenly like you have almost 10,000 subscribers, you have big following on Instagram, like so many people know you, and because you talk about your life, your kids, yourself, your mom, they feel like they do know you. Do you ever get that like celebrity rush that people recognize you and people approach you and you're like,
yeah. It's a funny thing. It's a little bit disorientating when it happens, particularly when somebody, of course, it's a very unequal dynamic, because people who do come up to you know significantly more about you than you do about them. So that's and then also, you'll impart information as you might in a conversation, and they'll respond with going, oh yes, I know, and they'll add something else about the information about yourself, and you go, oh yeah.
You do know.
So yes, it's a strange kind of disorientating experience, but it's also very lovely too, because everybody that's ever approached me in a yarn shop or at a yarn festival, or had somebody recognize my voice in a charity shop once as well, which was a funny experience. Edinburgh's not a big place. But whenever that's happened, everybody has always been very warm, very lovely, very enthusiastic about the channel and about the knitting. And the knitting always gives us points of connection. It always gives us something to talk about. So you never find yourself kind of lost for conversation. It's always present. So no, it's good.
Well, like you said, your mom and your friend encouraged you to start the podcast. How were your children reacting that the mom is influencer, YouTuber?
Well, I know that my youngest son quite regularly checks out how many subscribers I have, and then teases his friends who don't have the same number, which makes me laugh. But no, they're good about it. I think everybody's a little bit bamboozled about it, because if you're not in the knitting community and you don't watch knitting podcasts, then the whole knitting podcast YouTube scene is a bit of an anomaly. It's a little bit strange. So it's just kind of getting their heads around that. But Aurora has been on the channel because I brought her on to talk about her kilt making. So that was a fun thing. And then of course Mum has been on it now too. She was on the last episode. So yeah, the family is definitely on board, but it's a strange phenomenon.
Well, did you have to beg them, bribe them, or were they begging you and bribing you to get on your channel?
No, I definitely was the instigator. I asked Aurora if she wanted to come on and talk about her kilt making, just because I thought, my viewers would be particularly interested in it. And I think I had mentioned, purchasing a kilt for my middle son when he turned 21, and having to knit these kilt socks. I am not a sock knitter, so having to knit cabled, long cuffed socks for men. I've now had to do one pair a year, so I'm about to do another pair. But I know that I'd mentioned that, and so I thought, well, I'll bring Aurora on, and then she can talk a little bit about the process, because kilt making is an endangered craft. It's actually on the list of endangered crafts now, and she is one of the youngest trained kilt makers so in Scotland. So I thought, well, we'll bring her on and she can talk a little bit about the process. And I thought people would probably be quite interested to know this is another way in which wool is used in Scotland. So that was fun, and she didn't need too much persuasion. My mum needed a little bit more persuasion. She's a very private person, and yes, doesn't really doesn't really interact on social media and things as well. So it was quite a big step up for her to come onto the episode and share her knitting. But we so enjoyed doing it, and it's had that episode has had such a lovely response, and everybody has been so loving and warm and welcoming that I'm sure I'll be able to persuade her for on another occasion.
No, and I'm sure that their respect for what you're doing went tenfold higher because they understood how difficult it is.
Absolutely. And Mum is always saying, I don't know how you remember all of the information. And I said, well, it's because I sit down before I record and I write it all out. So I've just refreshed myself.
Do you edit your recordings?
I edit them insofar as I will put text up to say what the pattern is and the designer. I will pop images up so people can see what I'm referring to sometimes. But other than that, generally not. Like I said, it's kind of a running jump, these recordings. So sometimes I'll record the beginning, like the little intro bit, and follow my words. And so then I'll stop the recording and I'll start again from the very beginning, and then I'll just run straight through. And sometimes you say silly things, and sometimes your knitting gets stuck on your earring, and sometimes sometimes you wish you had perhaps edited something out and that you didn't. But it's a natural form, I think, and it's relatively unprocessed. So it is just like somebody popping around for a cup of tea and a bit of knitting, and getting to explore that time with a friend. And actually, that's not an edited process. That is full of its quirks and its surprises, and that's what I think the podcast really benefits from, is that sort of naturalistic flow.
Right. Well, when you look back at your earlier podcasts, right, early episodes, do you ever watch them? Do you ever no? I mean, you're terrified to watch them because I know, I put out a lot of content by now, but I'm sort of afraid to go back and watch it because I'm I don't know what I was doing there. I don't know what I was asking, what I was saying. I'm hoping it's okay. I'm sure I could have done better. Do you have the same fear?
I did watch one back quite recently, a part of one back, because I'm knitting on a new fantastic. I can never say this word. Fantastic. Right. I don't know, by Stephen West. And I had already knitted one last year. And so I thought there was one particular part, and I was like, what did I do when I got to that part in the last shawl? And I thought, oh, maybe I mentioned it. I didn't, but I did go back. I did go back and rewatch that part, and actually the episode continued on, and actually I was quite engaged with it. The funny thing I find is when I do watch back an episode before I put it out into the world, so and I do tend to find that when I watch it back, I laugh along with myself. So apparently I find myself hilarious. And yeah, so I don't have too much of an issue of going back and watching, but then I haven't gone back to the very earliest. I haven't rewatched the first one.
It might be an interesting party, to get a couple of friends together and watch some of the first episodes.
For the second podiversary, which is next month.
Well, when you started, did you see it going that long? And now when you think about it, do you see yourself being 75 and still doing this podcast?
Until something comes along that kind of, disrupts it or makes it not an enjoyable process anymore, I can't see not continuing with it. But then, I had a blog when blogs were a thing, and and I blogged every day until I didn't, or I was on Twitter for years, tweeting on a regular basis until I wasn't. So sometimes I think a platform will go through particular changes, or a new modality, a new form of media comes forward that feels more intuitive or more appropriate to how you want to deliver your message. And at that point, you shift and you move with the times. So, unless that happens, I will probably continue making YouTube videos.
There's this British show Afterlife, and it's a dark comedy because the guy's wife dies from cancer, but it's there are a lot of funny beats. But every episode starts with her recording. So it's before she died, she recorded herself, and some of it is as simple as don't forget to feed the dog and don't forget to brush your teeth, and some of it is very insightful. Do you ever feel you're leaving your legacy behind by recording yourself, by doing this podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we do have to think in the terms of creating digital legacy. I don't think we need to have it at the forefront of our mind, because I think otherwise that would trip us up and we'd probably never begin, because the weight of it would be too magnificent. But I do think that actually we are curating and cultivating a digital footprint that's going to continue on long after we're no longer around. And so what do you want that to look like? What do you want that to be? What do you want the message to be? And, I genuinely think that we will never know the impact of our presence in this world. It's just not possible for us to ever kind of get a sense of that. But the ripples are going to move out across, the immediacy. So the people who are watching it right now, as soon as you record it, but then there's going to be people who are impacted by what you're saying, what you're doing from years hence. Maybe it's only ever going to be one person, and actually maybe that's fine, you know.
Well, what's your hope for this channel? Like, what are you trying to achieve by having this channel?
Well, the reason why I called it The Meaningful Stitch was because I wanted to bring meaning back to making, you know. So it's not just about trends, it's not just about conspicuous consumerism. It is actually about engaging within the making process and leaning into that as a form of sacred practice. And so I hope that what people receive from the podcast, even if I'm not referring to that directly, is a sense of how I approach my knitting and how, you know, some of the gifts of that approach. So yeah, I hope that's what people receive. Although the overwhelming comment that I receive is how soothing my voice is. So maybe I'm just putting you all to sleep, and that's actually what I'm here for.
Well, when you're talking about gift giving, are there people who you find not knit worthy? Like, is there somebody who you would not knit for?
I can't think of anybody in, you know, that I've knitted for that I wouldn't knit for again. Everybody that I've knitted for has been very grateful for the knit. But actually, a lot of the gift giving process, I think, is you've handed over the gift and now it's up to them. You know, it's you don't own the gift anymore. You know, you've relinquished it, you've created it, you've passed it on. What they do with it is up to them, because it is theirs. You know, so I don't really subscribe so much to a sense of somebody being knit worthy or not knit worthy. Do I believe that I want to give you a gift? Do I believe that I want to invest my time, labor, skills, resources in that gift? And if so, then that's what I've done. And now that's given away. It's no longer mine. I don't get to control what you do with it, or where you wear it, or, you know, how you wash it, or any of the things. That's completely theirs to do with as they wish. So yeah, I'm not sure I entirely subscribe to a knit-worthy construct of a person.
Well, what about people giving you gifts? Do you get handmade gifts? And are those more like important for you than something that's store-bought?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a beautiful thing, I think, when somebody has taken the time, energy, and effort to create something for you, because every creation is an aspect of their self-expression, and you know that needs to be celebrated in the world. It needs to be honored and it needs to be cherished. And here we have an object in physical form that they have poured their soul into, because that's what we do, you know, through our hands, through our making. It's an expression of that, of our soul in the world. And we've decided to give that to, you know, to another person that they think that would like it. So absolutely, whenever anybody gives me anything that's been handmade, it's a huge privilege and such a deep honor. Yeah.
When you make something with like leftover yarns, is that like a trip down memory lane for you? Because like you remember everything else you made with those?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that kind of knitting, because you know, I think each time you knit with something, you know, your life is happening at the same time, you know, so you've got memories that you attach with that particular knitting experience. And you know, this was happening, or we were moving house, or you know, we saw this movie, or we're watching this TV series while I was knitting on that, or whatever it is. All of these kind of strands and memories are woven into the fabric, or knitted into the fabric that we're creating at that particular moment in time. So when we work with those scraps, those leftovers, you know, it's like we take those memories of that particular time when we first worked with it, but now we're creating new memories with it as well. So it's almost as though we're kind of layering these narratives of our lives on top of each other, I think, by using up these leftovers. Leftovers, that doesn't sound quite honoring enough.
Well, what kind of knitter do you think you are? Like, are you an ambitious knitter who likes to learn new techniques? Do you see knitting as something more relaxing? Like, how do you see yourself?
I do like to be a bit challenged by my knits. I don't. I do knit some things specifically just as a relaxing knit, and particularly if I'm going on a long trip or if there's a lot happening in the background. Sometimes you just want a garter project, a garter shawl to work on, and that's kind of just bubbling away. But alongside that, I do really need something which is a little bit more challenging, that asks a bit more of me. Whether that is just because I'm having to pay more attention to what it is that's actually on my needles, or whether that's because I'm learning a new technique, or a new skill. And I do think that's one of the wonderful things about knitting, is it is continually teaching us. You know, the possibilities and opportunities for expanding our understanding of this craft are just endless. You know, I think I could knit till the end of my days, and I will still not know even a small percentage of all there is to know about knitting. And that feels very rich, you know, and exciting.
Oh, besides knitting socks, like, is there anything else in knitting that sort of out of your comfort zone and or intimidates you, or you're like, I want to knit it, but like, I don't know, it sounds difficult. Like, is there something that on your future, maybe one day I'll try kind of thing?
Oh gosh, I've never done intarsia.
Me neither.
Every time I see intarsia, I'm like, oh, okay. So I'm intrigued by it, but I haven't yet done a project that's required that from me yet. So I would say that's going to be something in the future. I think I have the Scout shawl pattern. What's her name? Florence somebody. But the Scout shawl is a really lovely colour work design shawl that uses a lot of intarsia in it, and I think at some point I would like to knit that. So that's kind of, it feels a little bit outside of the comfort zone. I'm not there yet. Socks I just cannot get on with. I can knit them, and I have knitted them. I've knitted pairs for myself, my husband. If he ever requests anything, it's usually, can I have a pair of socks? And I will begrudgingly knit them for him. And obviously knitting these socks for the kilts is a bit of a labour of love. So I can do them. They're just absolutely they're not my happy knitting place.
Well, how many projects at the same time do you work on usually? Is it like, are you one project at the time kind of girl?
So I used to think I was a monogamous knitter, but actually doing the podcast has made me realize that I'm actually not a monogamous knitter at all. I don't have lots and lots of projects on the needles. I think that would feel overwhelming. So my ideal place is to have 2 or 3 on the needles. So for the moment, I've got the Fantastic that I'm working on. I've got the Long Summer Cardi by Hoki Locatelli, which is a bit of a longer project, and I'm about to cast on a camisole project. So again, those 3 feel like a comfortable sort of mix. I've got like a small project that's a bit more portable. The Fantastic, you know, requires a bit more attention, and the Long Summer Cardi is just evening knitting in front of the telly, so I can, you know, I don't have to pay too much attention to that.
I was interviewing Susana de Rosa, and Susana basically for the last decade worked on swatching Shetland lace, Victorian lace. She worked a lot with the Shetland Museum. And so she has this like whole board of little lace swatches, right? And I said, you know, it's like, to me, it seems like you could have made so many shawls like in the same time, right? Like instead of doing the swatches, like why did you spend so much time of your life doing those swatches? And she said, well, there is only like that many shawls I can wear, and my daughters don't need any more shawls, and my friends don't need any more shawls. Are you ever afraid that like you'll drown in needs?
I will have too many shawls.
Or everything, shawls, sweaters, socks, everything.
Yeah, I think maybe that's why I balance out knitting for other people a bit more now than perhaps I did, you know, maybe even say 4 years ago or so. I would say I probably knit more for other people now than I did before. there's always people to knit for. There's always more people that would like a jumper or a hat or whatever. So for me personally, I have yet to hit the saturation point in my hand knitted wardrobe. And maybe I will get there at some point, and maybe at that point I'll give things away, or maybe I'll auction some pieces, or give them away as prize draws or whatever. But at the moment I'm not there yet.
I mean, is there like a single piece that you would never give to anybody, never sell, never part with?
Oh gosh. I think there's a few pieces. I did the Marled Magic sweater I knitted for my 40th birthday. And that was a big project, like pulling together all the different yarns and then exploring the marling technique and where positioning all the things, and then getting the finished item. So that feels like a very significant piece, and it's quite unique, so I'm not even sure anybody else would want it. But yes, I'll hold on to that one.
Just in case somebody wants to, it's not for sale. Well, I loved meeting you. I mean, thank you so much for being my guest today. And, I think we might do something together with Natasha in the future. Maybe we'll do some knit along between the channels and see if I can conquer Natasha. Thank you.
Thank you so much.